Okay, here's my heretical statement for the day. 98 Live Meltdown from Priest with Ripper Owens on vocals might be my favorite live album ever. But don't tell anybody because I know that's not a cool thing to say.
That is a very strong statement, I gotta say, man. As a Priest fan,
It's daring, it's bold, but I gotta go with it.
I decided to change my background because of that. Now we have
There you
the
go.
best
Okay.
live album of all time.
Hey everybody, just me again, Wayne. I think you're really going to like what I've got for you today. Going to start off with a quiz though. First, the material you'll need for the quiz. The Metal Pilgrim YouTube channel, owned and operated by Vladislav Studnik. This channel features scores of interviews and dissections of classic metal albums. Vlad has interviews with people from all over the metal community, even, yes, up to and including the metal god himself, Rob Halford. I know, I was a little blown away by that myself. And in his discussion of metal albums, Vlad brings up all kinds of interesting shit that I have no idea how he gets all this information. But he does, and it's fascinating. I highly recommend Metal Pilgrim. Now, Max Carlisle's channel, Guitar Max. Max is the best. Max does interviews, and his big thing is reviews of guitars and other gear that is affordable and that works really well. How amazing is that combination? And he has instructional materials, he does some instructional videos, and and his playing is phenomenal. I would say that Max is the Shredder's Shredder, but my saying that might embarrass him. Oh, wait, I said it, didn't I? Well, there you go. What do these two dudes have in common? Well, each owns a YouTube channel or runs a YouTube channel. Each is very smart. Each is quite personable. Each knows a hell of a lot about heavy metal. And both agreed to do a group discussion with me about heavy metal. And that's what I've got for you today. The first of two, maybe three parts of our discussion about 80s heavy metal. How it started, what happened to metal in the 80s, and how it led to metal as we know it today. Yes, even through those dark, dim years of the 90s, when to admit you were a metalhead, at least in the United States, was sort of like having a big scarlet A, or a scarlet M, I guess, that you had to wear around all the time. So anyway, it was a joy to talk to these two guys. I had a lot of fun, and I hope that Vlad and Max had fun too. They told me they did, so that's good. Anyway, without any more blithering from me, let's get into this. The first part of the group talk about 80s metal with Max Carlisle and Vlad Studnik. I hope you like it.
Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Got a very cool thing going on today. Got a group discussion with Vlad Studnik, the Metal Pilgrim.
Yeah.
His YouTube channel is known. And Max Carlisle, Guitar Max of Guitar Max fame and Heavy Metal Horizons fame, and all kinds of other fames too, I'm sure. As far as I can tell, every major musical genre has subgenres, just like every plant or every animal has subspecies. And although heavy metal has been extant since either 69 or 70, I guess that depends upon whether you count Led Zeppelin or Black Sabbath as the first true metal album. The 80s saw metal and its fan base connect in a way that arguably has never been equaled in another musical form, either qualitatively or quantitatively. Now, that having been said, by 1982 or 1992, I should say, in the United States, anything remotely resembling metal had been relegated to the class not of a second-class citizen, but more like a ninth-class citizen. But in the US, that cultural placement has, I don't know if it's changed, if it's really changed, or if just the perception of we who like metal has changed over the past 15 or 20 years. as Christopher Hilton describes in his book, The Spectacular Rise, Fall, and Rebirth of Hair Metal, which is a really good book. I recommend it highly. So I guess the issue before us, WTF? How is it that now metal, in a way, at least in the United States, has come back to life over the last few years?
I've got a few ideas. Vlad, I don't know if you want to go first.
Yeah, go ahead, man. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I think there's a few things. I mean, this is a complicated issue, as talking about metal always is. But I think that there's a few different things that come to mind. One is that if we look at just the world in general and other countries besides the US, the classic path that those metal bands took was 91, 92, 93. The popularity started to die out in the US. They went to Japan. A few years later, things in Europe became really popular. And even in the 90s, and in the US in the 90s, we think of that as a very dark time for metal. You had new metal bands and you had Pantera, and that was about it. But even in the 90s, there were still some incredibly, there were some classic metal albums that came out in the 90s, but they were from European bands, or they were from bands that were popular in Europe. Like Manowar is a US band, but they're very popular in Europe. So I think metal retained its popularity, but the audience maybe changed. And I think that if you look at, we have this sort of period in the 90s, like you're talking about with Judas Priest, with Ripper Owens and this kind of thing, where the bands had been, those bands that had been around for a while, 15 or 20 years, they went through some sort of fundamental shift, either like a major band member left and then came back a few years later, right? Or, even with Iron Maiden, aside from the vocals, you have the changing guitar players, this kind of stuff, so other things changing in those bands. But again, those artists were still busy and they were still doing things and they were still popular. It just wasn't maybe with the audience that had existed before. So the other thing that comes to mind, it's hard to say, but there's a difference between the level of, I don't want to say seriousness of the audience, but how much they pay attention to the band. And the typical thing with pop artists, right, is the audience will know the hits, but they maybe are not really paying attention to the older material or the deeper cuts on the album and this kind of stuff. And so I think over time, because the metal audiences are so fanatical about the bands, right? Because the metal audiences are like that, I think metal has had a much better retention long-term of the audience over time. And so, when you talk about the success or failure of the music industry today, and you look at bands like Judas Priest is a great example. If you look at where they place in the Billboard charts, that has been climbing steadily over the years. It's not so much because they have been in selling more, but it's because the other artists have kind of failed in that regard. And pop artists and so forth are doing worse and worse and worse. But metal, because it has such a fanatical audience, that the popularity that was there hasn't so much increased. Even when you look at the numbers, it looks like it's increased, but it's actually just because those numbers have retained and the other things have fallen away, which I think is a credit to the genre.
So audience devotion, as it were, or dedication. I don't know of. When my kids were in school, Eminem was incredibly popular, but I'm not sure that either of my kids could have. If I said, "Hey, what are some of the really good deep cuts on the latest Eminem album?" I'm not really sure that they could have told me. And that's nothing against my kids, but it's just was kind of somebody's going to get really pissed off at my saying this, but I'm probably neither of you guys. But I think of that as like disposable music.
I'm not sure about disposable. I just want to go off, if you don't mind, of what Max was saying here. And I agree on parts of it. So I'm the only one here who is from across the pond for you guys, right? So from Europe. And I was actually born in USSR, where metal, and we spoke about that with Rob Halford during an interview, right? Where metal was actually forbidden. Like you could actually physically go to jail for blasting heavy metal. And that was what was happening, behind the Iron Curtain. And when in 1989, then, the Iron Curtain fell, in 1991, USSR fell, that opened a huge market of hundreds of millions of people. It is, population-wise, is bigger than that of the United States in reality, right? So I completely agree with Max. And I remember the 90s in Ukraine, and that's when the boom of heavy metal was for us. But there's a slight catch here. Number one thing is that those people didn't have much money, after the fall of USSR. So they would not actually go out and purchase new albums. And number two thing is that there was a lot of music for them to catch up on, right? I mean, we didn't have the 80s, we didn't have the 70s, and all of that suddenly became available, right? So there was a huge fan base growing over here in Eastern Europe, right? Poland and going eastern from there, of heavy metal maniacs who just eagerly started exploring everything they've missed out for the past decade. Yes, I mean, just don't get me wrong, heavy metal was available here, but it was very underground, right? I mean, like you had to rip the tapes, and it was very hard to get. You couldn't go to a store and purchase an Iron Maiden album or something like that. So that happened, and I completely agree that all of those bands kind of shifted over here for most parts. Number two, the problem with the heavy metal marketing in the United States, especially in the 80s, and I think a couple of people actually spoke about that in the book. I believe Rob Halford actually in Confess spoke slightly, a little bit about that. It was always targeting a very specific niche audience. It was a huge audience, but it was very specific and niche. And suddenly that audience in the 90s became busy. I mean, they started having kids. They started, going off to real jobs and stuff like that. So, and not everyone, of course, but a lot of people were simply, heavy metal wasn't on their mind constantly at that time, right? So they had to switch the audiences somehow and look for new audiences, across the globe. And that's what they did. Latin America is a huge example as well, right? I mean, look at Rock in Rio in the 90s, or in the early 2000s in Brazil. I mean, it's huge, right? And it has been growing since then as well. And about what Max was saying about fanatical audience. I mean, heavy metal, despite all its flaws in marketing that it has kind of that happened during the 80s. One thing was absolutely amazing about it is that I'm not sure whether other musical genres can be called disposable at all. I mean, I don't personally believe that. I believe that, everyone has very different taste. And I mean, I'll be honest with you, I don't listen to anything else pretty much other than heavy metal, right? I mean, and rock and roll. But I do appreciate certain other, musical genres and styles. But heavy metal was the very first musical genre that was able to build a community around the music only, right? They've created a certain lifestyle. I mean, they created a certain fashion style. I mean, thanks to Judas Priest back in the 1979, 1980, right? And so on and so forth. So in addition to just being a kick-ass music, they were able to build this sense of community, kind of what Facebook has been doing, in 2010s and stuff like that. You could build your own little communities around a certain topic. So that's what the heavy metal did, and that's why it had so many devoted fans from across the globe.
What is it, do we think, about metal that has connected so strongly, so deeply, with the people who follow it, whether they're, just getting into metal now, or whether, like me, they've been following it since before dirt was invented, only shortly before dirt was invented. But what is it about metal?
Max, do you mind if I
go ahead?
I don't think there's anything about metal. I'm a huge metalhead, and I'll tell you that that's my thing. I mean, there are things about specific bands usually. I mean, just to give you an example, I once lived in Costa Rica, and my roommate was a huge reggaeton lover. Reggaeton, style of music. It's terrible, awful. I mean, don't listen.
I don't know.
It's very popular in Latin America. I mean, don't ever go and listen to it. It has nothing to do with reggae. but he was a huge reggaeton lover, right? And like he would go on, he would know all the artists, he would like go out and stuff like that and listen to it. And there is a huge reggaeton following in Latin America, right? So it's not only about metal. I mean, other genres started catching up on this idea of building a community around it. And I don't believe that there is one thing about metal, right? I mean, there are certain things about different metal bands, and let's remember that in the 80s and the 70s, there was not only heavy metal, present. Power metal was on rise, speed metal, thrash metal was huge, and those bands have their following as well. And it's huge. I mean, look at Metallica, for example, right? I mean, even though they've grown from just being a thrash metal band, of course, now, but there isn't really a thing about metal, I believe, right? And there's nothing special or magical about it. It's more about individual bands and their approach and their ability to evolve. And this is huge, and this is very important. I mean, I personally believe that why some bands, remained in the 80s and no one remembers about them, and some other ones are huge now and they're growing, or at least selling the same amounts as they were selling, what Max was saying, right? Is that they were able to evolve without actually going away from their roots. And those bands who invented one certain genre and style and stayed within that little frame, they kind of disappeared, most of them, right? I mean, because metal isn't constant. There is no such thing as heavy metal, and that's how you do it. I mean, there's no formula to it, right? I mean, it evolves like any genre, like any literal genre, like any musical genre, right? And those bands that were able to evolve, yet kind of not lose their sound, they're successful still.
I think you make some great points there, and I think I disagree slightly in that I don't think that there's nothing about metal that creates this sort of reaction to people over time. But I would say I don't think there's anything about metal that is deliberate that creates this kind of long-term thing over time. But I think there are some sort of emergent things or things that are kind of accidental, that just the way the audience developed maybe made it last a long time. And I think that has to do with there are themes in metal and certain messages which get, expressed again and again and again. And I think one thing about those messages, there's a lot of, fighting for what you believe in and standing up to, something that's suppressing you or something like that, or making the most out of things. There's a lot of messages of getting the most out of life and then rising up and this kind of stuff. There's a lot of those messages. And I think on one hand, I think those are very powerful messages. On the other hand, I think that is a message that can reach an individual. It can reach one person can listen to it without the rest of the audience and be receptive to it and be like, yeah, that means something to me. And then at the same time, it doesn't prevent them from being in a community where everybody gets the same message at the same time. Because I think there are some musical genres, maybe jazz or something like big band jazz or something like that, where to really get the full experience of it, you kind of have to be with other people who are also experiencing it and this kind of stuff. Or anything that is, dance music, I think would be like that. But I think metal, it can appeal. It has a message that appeals to someone as an individual, and at the same time, it can appeal to a group of people. And it because of that, you get that combination of somebody being personally influenced by the music, and at the same time that they have, the nostalgia aspect. They remember, I remember when I was with all my friends and I heard this song and that kind of stuff. And I think a lot of musical genres, you get one or the other, but you don't get both like you do in metal.
That's a great point, actually. I never thought of it that way. And I do agree with you that metal portrays certain, messages, but I don't think that there's a unified message for heavy metal, right? I mean, it started off, yes, about, individual freedom was a huge thing, right? Rights was a huge thing. Human rights overall and equality of rights and so on and so forth. But those kind of, I don't want to say that they faded away with time, right? They became not so apparent in heavy metal is genre, right? And don't forget that in the early 80s, we have this huge explosion of genre, right? What Wayne was talking about, right? And we started having, death metal, later on black metal, and huge variety of genres that didn't go the same path. I mean, that is still metal, right? I mean, those people are still metalheads, and I love death metal, right? I listen to it a lot, right? But if you take a look at the messages that those bands portray, those are very individualistic. I mean, they will not be applied to a group of people. So I agree with you, but that then kind of applies to, for me personally, to heavy metal and more traditional, metal genres which emerged in the 70s and early 80s.
Yeah,
I think these are really. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, no, I was just going to say, yeah, I agree with that, and I think one thing that is true, even in the subgenres of metal, the more specific those subgenres get, then I think the fans become less. The fans get pickier, I guess, when they get into those very narrow subgenres, right? And if someone is like, no, I'm all about the Italian Hollywood fantasy metal or something like that, then they're like, I don't like the black metals. I don't want that. It's too much screaming and this kind of thing. But if there's someone who is a more general fan, then they probably have a much easier time accepting all the different genres. Yeah,
I agree with you.
Ironically, even though we could argue that metal, while it is, I would say, probably alive and well right now, I think we probably could agree that it is not at the all-time height of its popularity or selling albums or whatever. I heard someone say the other day, nobody buys albums anymore, and I'm like, excuse me, Senjutsu or whatever the title is of the new Maiden album is coming out soon. I got my pre-order in already, so yeah, some of us still buy albums, and I totally forgot where the fuck I was going with this, but it would have been amazing. It would have just totally broke the conversation wide open. Oh yeah, I know what it was. It was this idea about music fans getting pickier the more they get into a specific type of music. I mean, like the first time I heard Iron Maiden, a friend of mine had been to a record store back when those existed, and according to him, he wanted to get a couple of bands that he'd never heard of. So he thought, oh, that's a cool cover. Iron Maiden, Killers. All right, great. And then he said he found what was it? Oh, the Scorpions, Animal Magnetism. And he bought the albums and he ran those off on cassette, and I listened to them and I thought these are amazing. But I didn't put them in any separate category, like I didn't think of them as being different, or some kind of separate musical style than Sabbath or Deep Purple or Led Zeppelin even. But people do get, whether it's, I think we can probably apply this to folks who are fans of music. Readers, I know, folks who are into like certain genres of fiction, whether it's science fiction or fantasy or crime fiction or whatever, begin as essentially omnivores. And it was something about whatever that general type of fiction is really grabs them, and so they read everything they can get their hands on. But pretty soon their grip gets, they're reaching less far than they did because they find that more specific type of of music or literary genre or whatever, that's what they like, so yeah. What was my point there? I think my point is I think you guys are right there. How was that?
Good.
Well, something related to this that I think about sometimes is that there are certain bands which are considered sort of gateway drugs into the genre, right? And Metallica is often cited as a band like this, where Metallica is maybe the first metal band that people hear, And then after that, they get into other bands, and then they get deeper into the subgenres. And I think there are even some bands where you don't, maybe the first time you hear them, you're put off by it. You don't really like it, and it becomes an acquired taste, right? And for me, King Diamond was like that. The first time I heard King Diamond, I'm like, why is he singing like that? What's going on? You know, this kind of stuff. But now it's, you know, it's one of my, you know, he's one of my favorite artists now. But it took me sort of a few years for my love of that to develop. But I think, kind of like what we were talking about earlier about sort of a combination of fans being very picky, but also very fanatical at the same time. The bands that are a little bit less accessible, where you take a longer to get into that artist, I think in a way those ones become the ones that people are the most fanatical about. And a band like Metallica, and I don't mean this in a bad way, but I think a band like Metallica ends up with a lot of sort of pedestrian fans as opposed to a super dedicated fan base that maybe a less accessible artist might end up with.
And there she be, part one of the group discussion with Vlad the Metal Pilgrim and Guitar Max. And me. I hope you liked this discussion. If you did, by all means give it a thumbs up. Share it with someone else who's into 80s metal or metal in general who might enjoy it. And if you feel so inclined, hit that subscribe button. Okay, come on back for the next part. Thank you very much for watching. As always, you guys are awesome, and I'll talk to you later.